specifically how we reached Adquiere. That's an interesting conversation. We were approached during the pandemic and those years by American companies, particularly to buy Accented. There was interest in buying nearshore development companies in Mexico to expand their operations. Initially, we weren't sure we should even not take them seriously or not, but do these make sense for us? Is it the right time? So we had several conversations internally, and long story short, we ended up moving forward with one of these conversations. It got to the point where we were very close to signing, and at the end of the day, the deal fell through. And our, let's call it M&A advisor that we brought on board for this specific potential sale is now my co-founder at Adquiere.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to La Frontera, a podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic startup and venture capital ecosystem in Latin America and the innovators behind it all. We're your hosts, Cyrus and Tom. If you enjoy this conversation, we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter where we announce new episodes and share additional insights and resources for founders and investors alike. We'd also like to invite you to share this podcast with your friends and to leave a review on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube to help more people discover the show. We love hearing from our audience. You can connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter by searching for La Frontera Podcast.
Welcome back to La Frontera Podcast. Today we are joined by Daniel Rodriguez. He's the founder of Adquiere, essentially a tech-enabled M&A firm with the vision of becoming the marketplace connecting buyers, sellers, and investors and facilitating secondary transactions for companies in LatAm. And we're really stoked to get into this topic right now. I think every conversation we've had with VC investors recently has basically centered around the biggest blocker to sustainable growth in the startup ecosystem right now is liquidity, aka lack of exits, which is exactly the problem Danielle is trying to tackle. So we'll get a little bit deeper into the M&A market and what Adquiere is trying to do, but I want to start from the beginning, Danielle. I know you've founded a few companies and you're also like a very influential voice in the startup and VC world in Mexico. So I would love to hear what kind of sparked your entrepreneurial spirit from the beginning, all the way back from growing up in Monterrey.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation. And getting to your question, it's been a journey. I've been an entrepreneur for, I don't know, like 13, 14 years, pretty much my entire professional career. I personally have always loved technology from the perspective of using technology to solve real world problems. And I started my professional career at Microsoft. At least that was my first formal job. Came back to Mexico. I worked a little bit in consulting, a little bit in telecom, specifically in sales. That was an interesting, I'll call it a stint because it was only like 6 months. But before I started my first startup, I said, I need to know if I can actually sell something to someone, right? If I can't sell, I can't be an entrepreneur. So I picked up that last job. And I remember like at the 6th month when they were offering me like the full-time position, I was like, I'm sorry, I actually have to go do this. And my manager was amazing. He said corporate won't. They said tocarse el corazón, which is like touch their hearts and kind of, they won't stop from firing you. Don't stop from quitting. So if this is what you got to do, this is what you got to do. For me, that was a pivotal moment when I said, okay, let's go get started. I had recently come back from Microsoft and at the time we created what we called Pixter, which was an application that was meant to help you discover new experiences. Our slogan was, what was it? Discover, rate, and share. And the idea was like, Foursquare meets Yelp meets Google Map. I know that sounds super stupid today when you fast forward, but at the time, Google Maps wasn't as strong as it was today in the sense of reviews and content. It was more about directions. And Foursquare was a bit better with reviews, and Yelp was super good with reviews, but not good with maps. So there were a few kind of missing links in our opinion at that time. And we essentially tried to help you, again, discover not just new restaurants. Maybe you had a craving for a certain type of pizza or tacos or whatever, and you could find the best tacos rather than finding the place. You found the best tacos, which in turn told you where to go get them, or whatever it was, maybe karaoke night, and you could find the best place to experience karaoke night. We committed every single mistake in the book. It wasn't even funny. That's what I want to get to. But after that, we essentially started a dev shop, or rather one of our co-founders had created a dev shop in the past. And at a meeting with a potential customer. So we were starting taking some side projects, and somebody kind of reached out and said, hey, can you build apps? And we obviously could. We built our own. But we weren't really selling much to the public. But I remember at that time we were like, just say yes, right? We can and we could. And we resuscitated, so to speak, brought back to life Accented, which was this dev shop. And then along the way, we've had quite a few other startups and ventures, and maybe we can talk a little bit about those in detail. But we've been in telehealth, in prop tech, and delivery. We even had an exit. We kind of battled it out with Rappi and Uber. We weren't going to win that one, but we managed to get a successful exit. And now I'm working on Adquiere, and that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's great. And all those from the first one, obviously, you start learning those lessons, you make those mistakes. I started something with my friend a couple of years ago, and it failed pretty miserably. Made every single mistake. And I was reading a book about entrepreneurship. It was Viva the Entrepreneur by Brian Reckworth. And he has a chapter going through all the mistakes that you can make as an entrepreneur. And I basically just checked every single box. But if I ever decide to found a company in the future, then it's different playbook, right? And you know exactly what to avoid. And hopefully after continuous iterations of starting companies, you get to the one where it all kind of clicks. But yeah, I would love to hear, I guess, through that journey and just being an entrepreneur, knowing entrepreneurs, being in the ecosystem, what really sparks that idea to found your newest venture and like realizing what the problems were that felt like you needed to solve.
So I'll mention first that when you talk about checking off that list, we had a very similar experience, but I joked that we even added a few new ones to that list. Like we made so many that there were even new ones to add. But it is what it is. As you said, like you learn from them and you typically don't make the same mistake twice. Maybe you can, but it's less probable. One of the things that really worked for me as well is building this dev shop, right? Building Accented enabled us to work with both startups and super large corporations, both locally and internationally. So we've had the privilege of working with founders at different stages in different countries. And we had a lot of experience building startups for others, right? So that helped a lot in understanding, again, like what to do correctly, how to not mess it up. So it always enabled us and pushed us towards building new things. And specifically how we reached that get it, that's an interesting conversation. We were approached during the pandemic and those years by American companies, particularly to buy Accented. There was interest in buying nearshore development companies in Mexico to expand their operations. And initially, we weren't sure we should even not take them seriously or not, but do these make sense for us? Is it the right time? So we had several conversations internally. And long story short, we ended up moving forward with one of these conversations. And it got to the point where we were very close to signing. And at the end of the day, the deal fell through. And our, let's call it M&A advisor that we brought on board for this specific potential sale is now my co-founder at Adquiere. What happened was once the deal fell through, I started asking myself these questions like, we were so close, maybe it made sense. And could we explore this with somebody else? What would that look like? How do we find a new buyer? Where do we find them? Are these buyers legit? And the first thing I did is like, how do they do it in the US? And I recalled I had registered on acquire.com. It's not a coincidence that we're similar. I'll just say we took some inspiration from there. And I saw what they were doing in the US, but I started looking at LatAm in particular. And what I noticed is there's a few that are specialized in certain niches. So for instance, there's one in Chile, it's called Sitio de Tienda. They focus on transactions for e-commerce. There is Negozona, which is more of like let's call it a more of a listings kind of thing, classified, where usually you'll buy like very small businesses, right? Like, buy my coffee shop that I'm thinking about closing, or which are typically small transactions. There's a few others out there, but what we ended up noticing is that nobody was really solving a problem for SMBs and micro businesses. And the ones that were looking at that space were not Latin American companies. There are a few from Europe in particular, but they were doing it more for themselves, right? Like they're an M&A firm, they upload opportunities, and they are the ones that control the transactions. We look at this in a different manner, right? We think about it, and what we're looking at is that M&A shouldn't be for a chosen few that have enough money to pay a certain firm or that have a certain type of connection or a certain economic level or whatever it is that's blocking them shouldn't be a blocker. I remember calling my co-founder. At the time, wasn't my co-founder and was more of a business partner. I remember calling him in the morning when I was dropping my kids off at school, and I'm like, "Send me the bill, but I still want to talk. I want to talk about this, and I have this idea." And at the end of the day, we both agreed that it made sense. Like any company, again, should be able to sell. Any company should be able to raise. And the way we've approached this, again, we are also an M&A firm. We have our team. We perform valuations. We perform transactions just like an M&A firm would. But we've opened up our marketplace for everyone. Like you don't have to transact with us as your partners. We even have a partner program for brokers. If you are an M&A firm or a broker, you don't pay the transaction fees and whatnot that a typical that our customer would pay. There's different infrastructure for that. So we're trying to evolve into the best place to buy and sell businesses in LatAm and potentially on the Hispanic market, Spain, Portugal, and Brazil as well.
Continuing on along the topic of building out Adquiere, you don't have a traditional M&A background, right?
I don't.
Yeah. So I was curious, from your perspective, what was that experience like building out a tech-enabled M&A firm? And what were some of the challenges you faced kind of building out this Adquiere without a traditional M&A background? And do you think that provided you a different perspective to approach this a little bit differently than some of the traditional players, and that's contributed to your success?
I'm certain it contributed to my success. Like I have no evidence, but no doubts either. So the fact that I had already built a few other startups, that I had experience with business models in the startup ecosystem. An M&A firm isn't necessarily better or worse than us. They're different, right? And their focus is 100% on the transaction, and that's what they do, and that's what they've been designed to do. And again, they probably do it better than us, at least at this stage. But what we do better, however, is technology. And technology enables or will enable us, and it's enabling us to improve how these things are done. So one of the first things that I would respond in terms of like why this was better, again, an M&A firm would have to build out a tech team or outsource a tech team to build this out. And this would probably be treated, especially the higher you go into the M&A firm spectrum, it would most likely be treated as a pet project, as a side project, and it's not in their best interest to kind of give deals to others. Their best interest is for them to bring in deals for their firm. The way we're approaching this again is more so of everyone can bring deals. Everyone can sell, everyone can raise, everyone can invest, everyone can buy. This enabled us to build the first version of Adquiere in just about 2 weeks. And it was more than enough. Like I'd even say that much of what you're seeing today isn't that far off from what we built then. We've just been pivoting and adding little things that kind of make sense along the way. And it's definitely worked very well for us in being more agile, more nimble. And again, in this mission to democratize M&A and to build this into the default M&A marketplace for LatAm.
Yeah, and actually continuing on that theme, so you mentioned building out the platform without having much of a true kind of like developer background or tech background. So I was curious, what was that like then, building out the early stages of Adquiere without a true like technical background?
So again, this was a self-imposed constraint. We didn't want to mix it up with Accented, our dev shop, because there's different investors and different. We just couldn't mix it. So what ended up happening was like this is something that I realized we had to do. I knew it was the right problem, at the right place at the right time, and we definitely had to at least test it out. So the first thing I did when I realized that we couldn't use these resources that we had, and I was the most technical co-founder, at least in terms of, let's say, programming. One of our co-founders is an M&A expert, and the other co-founder is, let's say, more like a UX and UI design expert. I'm a bit more of I'd say I'm typically sales-oriented or historically and management-oriented. But like when I see a problem, I just think about how to solve it rather than just getting stuck. And what I ended up doing initially was I started taking an actual computer science course from Harvard. It's very famous. It's called CS50. I got about halfway through it and I realized that I was learning a lot, but I also realized that there was too much depth for what I needed at the time, and the knowledge I was going to get there, although fantastic, wasn't really going to get me to the point that I needed at that time. So I ended up switching the strategy a bit and started researching no code and low code solutions. And anyways, I ended up deciding on a tech stack, which initially kind of is born out of no code technologies or solutions. I recall coming back to my co-founders and I essentially showed them the first version of the product. It was horrible in terms of design, but it worked. They were surprised. They didn't expect it to come back from a weekend and I have a working version of this product. Maybe I'm exaggerating a weekend, maybe it was two, but the point is like a very short amount of time. And it did enough for us to get started, right? Like it validated or allowed us to build something or what you would traditionally call an MVP, right? It did the minimum. It was a minimum viable version of our product that was enough for us to get that out there, put it in front of customers, and get them to pay or to at least register onto the platform. It was very interesting. And I'm not gonna lie, we still use a lot of no code and low code components in our product, and it still keeps us nimble because it allows us to iterate much faster than if everything that we were building was stack of code with a dev team. Now that being said, we are working on a, let's call it version zero point 0.5. I don't even want to call it one, which is more codeful, if you will. And you will be seeing that pretty soon. But yeah, it enabled us to hit the ground running much faster. It has enabled us to pivot much faster. And it was a very exciting thing to do. Launch my personal first product. Pretty cool.
I would like to dig a little bit more on sort of product development. So when you created your MVP, who were the customers that you went to first? I'm guessing you already had you have a solid network built out, but who were the people that you trusted to talk to bring that no code sort of bare bones MVP to make sure it addressed all the things that they needed? And how many iterations did you go through before you had it really up and running like you do now?
So the answer to that is actually, I think it's funny. We have historically been building in public. Like we didn't go through iterations. We literally just launched, right? Again, I showed it to my partners. One of them laughed and said, "This is hideous. Let me just put a paint of code on it, a coat of paint, sorry." But other than it being ugly in aesthetic terms, it worked. So all we did was paint it up a bit and say, "This now looks pretty nice." And we've got a ton of compliments on it after we pimped it up in terms of design. And we literally just said, "Let's launch. Let's go at it. Let's just go and see what the market says." And we didn't want to keep it under wraps because there was no reason to do. Again, I'm not afraid of anyone copying my ideas. I personally, I don't. I think that it's all about the execution. And I mean, the idea is out there. We're already doing it. If somebody wants to copy it, they can. What we did instead is rather than focusing on what could go wrong, we simply said what could go right. Like people wanting or needing what we were offering, and we just went at it. Now, something interesting that I should mention, however, is my co-founder Roberto did have an M&A firm. He had customers, so it was a bit easier kind of shifting his network towards us initially and just shifting all what he had been building, all that momentum from his firm to Adquiere definitely helped. Again, like I'm very active on LinkedIn as well, so all I did is started shifting a bit of my communication towards, and just in general, like entrepreneurship through acquisition or buying company, selling your startup, selling your business. And nowadays, we like most of our growth is organic. The vast majority of it, it's not paid. We do some advertising. You have to do it just like in any other market. But again, the iteration of it or the iterative process has been in public. Like we're listening to what people are saying and we're making changes as soon as we understand if they should or shouldn't be made. And we have a wide variety of customers. We weren't sure. And we're still not 100% sure who the customers are. One of the things that people have asked me again is Acquiere.com, they're selling startups. Why aren't you doing the same thing? Like they already went through, I think it's 6 or 7 years of figuring it out. And I'm like, yes, they figured it out in the US where startups are left, you can find one left and right. And they figured it out because QuickBooks is one click connection via their API and financials are very clear. And there's X and Y and Z that kind of make it obvious for startups to be their target. Biz by Sell, for instance, or BizScout isn't focusing on that. And again, like there's a lot of questions on the markets aren't identical. And it's something that we're still looking at and what makes sense. But again, that's why we are building in public, trying to really understand like who really needs this the most, why do they need it the most, and trying to build more so for them. But yeah, we're still in, let's say, a learning stage.
That's awesome having the confidence to do that because you really knew there was a problem. You had experience with it. I was working with a startup that is having a little bit of trouble with that launching a new product where they're not 100% sure exactly what the problems are. So it's hard to know that you're like addressing them without starting with the bare bones MVP, going to people you trust and trying to figure out where should we actually be facing this towards.
Oftentimes you had a problem, but that doesn't mean that everyone else does. Like maybe you have a lower threshold for something. And in my case, that could have been maybe what I experienced wasn't for everyone. And that's why we said, let's just launch. Let's just launch and see what the market says. If they don't like it, then all we did was spend a few weekends, put a pane of code and tried it out. And it worked. And as it started working, then we started evolving the product to better cater the type of users that made sense catering to.
And I guess speaking about the problem, let's dig into a little bit of M&A stuff. M&A talk, LatAm, right? So the last time we spoke, you gave me a stat that I guess looking back is not super surprising, but it's definitely the first time you see it is interesting, right? So about 50% of M&A transactions that happen globally are in the US, and LatAm accounts for about 1%. And despite this, VCs, at least, they really depend on acquisitions to return money to their investors. In Mexico, Brazil, there is an IPO market, though not very liquid. But M&A transactions are dependent upon, even though it's a very tiny piece of the global pie. So what would you say are the main pain points preventing more M&A in the region? And you can give us your broad perspective of what the market looks like. My initial thoughts, just thinking about LatAm, lack of capital, lack of dry powder, and then sort of informality in finances and data reporting, that type of thing.
All of what you mentioned is true. That is definitely part of the problem. We've also noticed, like, for instance, a lot of the businesses in Mexico are family owned. I'm not saying that a US it isn't that way, but I think that there's a very strong attachment. Like oftentimes people see this business as their legacy, and it's harder for them to say goodbye to it, right? To accept that maybe it's time to sell. Another point that you mentioned, and you said like lack of liquidity and like lack of dry powder or capital rather. In the US, one of the things that I see that helps it work is like exits can create a virtuous cycle, right? If a founder exits, whether it's via IPO and then sells some stock and whatnot, they have now capital in their pocket, which they can now in turn deploy, whether that's as an angel investor or that's as whatever it is into stocks or whatever. Point is they can deploy capital into the market again in a different way, shapes, or forms. And we don't see that as often. Like we're in a vicious cycle where if there are no exits, then there is no money to put back into the market, and therefore kind of starts stagnating on its own. What we think or we believe that Adquiere will enable is even if these are smaller transactions. Again, like I don't expect $100 billion transactions anytime soon, but definitely we should see some large-ish transactions, at least for the market. So we believe that we're enabling connections that typically have been harder to make those happen. Again, just connecting the right person or the right buyer with the right company isn't as easy as it sounds, at least in LatAm historically. So enabling that and making, that, again, democratizing that and making it open for everyone should enable more transactions. And then hypothetically and hopefully, these transactions in turn will enable future transactions because these people now have capital in their hands, which they can deploy back into the market. I'm certain this is something that can help. Now, is it the silver bullet that will save everything and fix everything? I don't think so. But I definitely believe this is a right catalyzer that can really help the region. There's obviously a bunch of other things, such as in the US, I forget the acronym, but there's this, you have seller financing, but then there's also these loans that the government provides to buy companies. And the idea, from my understanding, is like they provide these loans because closing a business has other repercussions that the government doesn't want. And potentially, if you put this company in the hands of a right buyer, it'll even increase in value and create more jobs and potentially merge further down the road. The reality is that in Mexico, we don't have that type of support. And I don't want to say about this government in particular. I just think it's something that historically hasn't been available. Maybe in the future, we'll see some of this develop in the region, but there isn't really, like, the government isn't pushing the M&A ecosystem. And I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And there's probably other regulatory hurdles and whatnot, but I don't think those are the most important ones. That's probably something that happens in the higher end spectrum of M&A deals.
On that note, then, I know you mentioned the United States, obviously you have SBA loans. And for context, I once 2 years ago purchased a business at an SMB in the United States. So I have some experience there. I have a few friends that went down the ETA route. So this is pretty near and dear to my heart. But I know in the United States, obviously they have SBA loans, right? There's two different types. There's a lot of support in the United States for if you want to start a business from scratch or purchase a business, real estate, etc. In In Mexico, in Latin America, what are the typical financing routes that most buyers take when acquiring a business? And we'll follow up with another question related to the buyers that you typically see, but was curious just like what have you seen in terms of the typical types of financing?
There's obviously more traditional financing where banks get involved and there's different ways to get access to the capital. We've seen a few in a few of our interactions in the deals that we've seen on the platform. We've seen seller financing, right? Like you buy part of a company, you pay upfront a certain amount and then just finance the rest through the operations. That's actually one of the most common ones that we've seen. And I think that in smaller transactions, it's cash upfront. Like they're not large enough for it to be a family office. Here have I'm gonna make up a number like $200,000. It is what it is, right? Like they just go out and buy that. Hopefully, I'll have more statistics going further. But right now, again, seller financing is the most common one that we've seen.
And then following up on that, so the types of buyers that you see, obviously in the United States with Acquire.com, a lot of the SaaS companies, you see a lot of folks that are just trying to buy up SaaS companies and cash flowing businesses and then operate them into perpetuity usually. Otherwise, you typically see PE firms conducting buyouts and turnarounds and then selling them back to other firms. But for the Latin American market, obviously the challenge is you have to have the cash if you're going to do cash up front. And it obviously depends on the valuation of the business itself for how much cash you'll need. But typical profiles of buyers that you see that are buying these SMBs in Latin America.
So I'll first approach about like what the spread look like in terms of registrations and then talk about what it looks like in terms of transactions. About 50 something percent, like a bit above 50% of our registered investors they identify as angels or high net worth individuals, right? So they're people that are their own money going out and buying companies. About what is it, like 5% are corporate venture capital, 5% are family offices. Interestingly, about 10 to 15%, I don't remember the exact number, are other companies, not corporate, let's call them like SMBs that are trying to buy other SMBs. And I can't recall the exact numbers, but somewhere between 5 and 10 each, private equity and search funds. Now, the actual activity has been much higher with search funds and private equity than pretty much the rest. There's been approaches from corporate venture capital and family offices and whatnot with businesses, but where we've seen offers. So, I mean, we've been operating for quite a few months, and now I think it's 8 months. We've seen about 20 offers. I'd say that like 18 of those have been private equity and search firms that are trying to buy companies. I can't really get into details of all of the transactions, but yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of movement specifically, as you mentioned, like entrepreneurship through acquisition, where somebody straight out of MBA, potentially they had another business in the past or not, they raise some funds. And actually, that responds about acquisitions as well. Search funds are typically raising funds on their own. They build up this structure and then they come and acquire. But yeah, search funds and private equity have been moving quite a bit internal.
Speaking a little bit more about those profiles, you mentioned to me typically where they come from. So right now, as it stands, the people who are using the platform in LatAm or in the US, like from sort of Latino backgrounds of those PE firms and search funds, where are these sort of buyers from?
So it's interesting because all of our communication, we talk about LatAm and we try and even sometimes even bring it down to just like Mexico because we're just getting started. But again, it seems to be a pain all over the world. We've had customers, and I'll say we've had because not all the transactions have necessarily gone through, but there's been like significant interaction with firms and companies in Spain. We actually have a customer right now that we're working with in the US. We have a customer in Ecuador. We have in Mexico, obviously, we have quite a few. And I have to double check, but Chile and Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, we've also have a few companies there. And when I say customers, again, we are a tech-enabled M&A firm, although we're a marketplace at the same time. So part of understanding this pain is we advise a lot of these transactions, but we don't do it for all of them. Some of them are on their own, where we connect the buyer and seller, and it's a one-to-one kind of thing. We simply are enabling that interaction. Other cases, it's what some would view as competitors, but we don't. We see M&A firms and brokers as part of our ecosystem. They're on there as well. Trying to respond to your question, again, we start in Mexico, but we do have customers in other regions. Part of what we're looking at in terms of, I mean, I'd like to call it expansion, but it's not an expansion in terms of like opening offices, but rather of understanding how we can bridge that is there's a lot of Mexican American and Latin American citizens, in many cases, they have this kind of desire of going back home, at least mentally, or even if it's not necessarily going back home, they had all these opportunities and want to kind of pay it forward. So we know and we realize that there's a big opportunity of connecting, let's call the Hispanic community in the US and maybe Canada and other places, and enabling them to buy businesses or invest in businesses in the region. Same with Spain, right? Like a ton of us, and I speak for Mexico, but I know this is the case for most of Latin America. There's a huge connection with Spain, Brazil with Portugal. So there is a lot of, it makes sense to bridge those regions and enable cross-border transactions. It's something we're definitely working on, we're looking at, and will happen. We're just going one day at a time, and we have enough deals in Mexico as it is. But again, as I mentioned, we are starting to look at and work on some deals that start, let's say, touching those veins, so to speak.
Yeah, I really like that sort of theme of people who wanting to return home almost and go back to their home country, maybe buy a business and bring capital that they've maybe started earning like from the US. Like a lot of my friends in the MBA program were Latino. They come from LatAm, born and raised, and then come to the US. The typical track, they want to work in the US for a couple years. Almost everyone wants to go back home. And I can understand why. I'm in Brazil right now. If I didn't have to go back to finish my MBA in Chicago, I would not come back. But so I like that. I like that point though that you make. That definitely resonates.
I thought your home was in Brazil, Tom.
I wish maybe someday in the future. Although this Wi-Fi is not doing the trick right now.
So something that I want to mention is that like Adquiere, both our name and the platform is only available in Spanish. And this, at least in this stage, is intentional. Like we're trying to connect the Hispanic market at this point. It might sound dumb, like adding English might not necessarily harm us, but our logic is we're not even trying to compete with the US market. We're trying to complement it, right? If a larger firm in the US wants to buy a company in Mexico, we can do that. But we're trying to see this more of a connection between Spanish speaking at this time, primarily people and businesses. And we believe we always mention LatAm, right? Like Brazil is part of the plan. So technically Portugal becomes part of the plan and Spain as well. It just makes sense because again, there's a lot of these connections. I don't think that we'll block out the US. It's not the plan. It's just we're trying to take it one step at a time and trying to make it in such a way that there's this connection. But I think that down the road, like the US makes sense, not just because it's, again, the largest M&A market in the world, but also because, again, these connections are there. And maybe you have Hispanic blood or Latin blood, but you consider yourself now an American, and maybe that's your primary language and you prefer using our platform in English. We don't want to deny that. Today we do, but later on, I don't think it's necessarily part of our strategy.
I think that's, capitalizing on that community aspect is great, especially for growth, specializing in that market first. And then there's plenty of tools out there to translate your entire code into English. So you can always do that later on.
Correct. It's not something that keeps me up at night, definitely.
And then let's talk about on the seller side also, right? So bringing typically SMBs or anyone who's looking to sell their business. As we touched on, one of the pain points for M&A in the region traditionally is just finances, right? Or just basically like how that data is reported, how the data exists, where it exists. How do you prep sellers to actually get on your platform to make it easier to streamline the transaction process? What are like the requirements, maybe verifications and that type of thing?
Correct. So again, we're still in early stages, so a lot of this is evolving as we speak. So what we do right now is essentially the first thing we do is like when a company registers, we literally have a call with them. Every single one, it is a personal kind of thing. It's not just, oh, you registered, looks good, publish. It doesn't work that way. We actually reject quite a few companies. Something doesn't add up, something didn't make sense. Maybe the seller seems to be hiding something. Then right now it's a bit of more of a manual process, which we're working on automating KYC and KYB. One of the interesting things is like invoicing in Mexico is very well automated. I don't know how familiar you're with the system, but if you pay something or get paid something in Mexico, the government knows immediately, right? The invoice is literally connected to the equivalent of the IRS. So there's softwares out there that you can use and connect to the IRS equivalent and see if you're saying, I sold 30 million pesos. I'm like, hey, dude, it says 25 here. What up? And maybe those 5 million were in cash and maybe they didn't report it. And that's on there. And that's something I don't need to get involved with. That's, again, you talked about like informality and accounting. Like you do you, right? But okay, if you can demonstrate that the money is real and whatnot, that's perfectly fine. So we try and validate, and I say try because sometimes, again, your RFC and your like tax ID is something that not everyone is willing to share, and enabling us to connect to it is, again, not something people are always willing to share. So we can't always validate everything. So currently we're kind of managing different verification grades. Now, what we're working on for this next version of the product is kind of unifying them. Either you're verified or you're not. And the logic behind this, again, is to push sellers to verify. Like not being verified means that your company, people will most likely, buyers will most likely not be interested, or there will be, more fear or hesitation in terms of both contacting you or believing your information. So definitely one of our, let's say, core goals for this year is standardizing and improving our KYB process as well with KYC. So in terms of investors, again, I'll say we try to have calls with everyone. Some people might not be up for a call and allowing us to verify their information. But what I will say is part of the benefits of being in an early stage and some of the processes being manual is that the buyers don't connect directly to the sellers. They go through us. So that means that when a seller comes through us, we have to have a call, whether you like it or not. Like it has to happen. I remember once when we were kind of sitting together and we started seeing. So we have this automation on Slack, and it's like interest notifications of a buyer being interested or coming. We got 20 notifications. We were like, "What the fuck?" And we noticed that it was the same buyer. And then we're like, okay, this is fishy. So we kind of emailed him, and like, you essentially started like emailing or trying to contact the entire database. We realized that he thought he was contacting the owners directly, right? And it ended up being a dev shop that wanted to sell them nearshoring services. So we said, fantastic call. That's it. You're not moving forward. So what I want to get to is that being a bit earlier stage, having these manual processes has enabled us to really guarantee that even if this investor didn't allow it on the onboarding, once they say they're interested in something, I'd like to talk about this being like Tinder. It's like both have to swipe right. And we're kind of in between as a chaperone saying, hey, wait up. Before you can meet this girl, I want to understand why you're interested in her. We bring this information with the customer and say, this person wants to meet you, is interested in your company because of XYZ. His credentials are this. His company is this. He's a ex-representative of family office. And if that makes sense, then they'll say, okay, again, let's actually meet up. And we've had occasions where the response is, I don't want to meet them, even if it makes sense, or maybe because a person that wants to meet them is a competitor, maybe because they know them from something else and they don't, for whatever reason, they don't want to meet. But yeah, we do try to verify everyone, and we make sure to verify them as much as we can prior to connecting both parties. And both parties are informed of, let's say, the level of verification that everyone has got before they're connected.
We've got Bumble Date, Bumble Network, and now Bumble M&A. So I think all the bases might be covered.
Yeah. You can meet your future girlfriend and you can essentially buy a company with a similar platform.
For buyers, then, how do you guys vet buyers? Do you guys require proof of funds, things like that up front, or is that further down the road?
At this stage, we don't. Like typically, it's more of so you have to remember, and there's a lot of context, right? Mexico in particular, and LatAm in general, but Mexico in particular, isn't as safe. I understand that you guys always get all these red warnings, don't travel. Typically in the larger cities, you won't get that. Like there, it isn't as unsafe. But most people won't share, here, have my bank statement. It could be perceived by some people like putting up a target on your back.
Yeah, I won't do that in the United States either.
Correct. So we don't blame them. What we try and do rather is let's just have a call. Let's understand what your thesis is, why you're interested in certain type of companies, who you say you are, and you have LinkedIn and you have other tools to verify, and out of the KYC and KYB tools that help you verify certain information. We're improving some of these processes, but what I want to say is it's harder because not everything is as connected in terms of validation of funds and whatnot, but it's definitely something we want to work towards. And we do ensure that, again, like before we connect both parties, there has to be a call where we try. And when I say try to verify your identities, oftentimes we'll get a certain set of information. Maybe it's not like 100% verification, but it's good enough for us to go with the seller and say, this is missing. We believe this is good enough. It's up to you if you want to meet them. They don't have your information. You don't have theirs either. So nobody's going to compromise at that stage. And if you say no, we just go back and say no. So we try to, again, because we're smaller, because we're in an earlier stage, we can do this. Obviously, to scale, we have to automate this. We have to bring in like actual KYC and KYB where it's self-service and you kind of get validated X, Y, and Z. Maybe not funds, but we get to a 90% place where we all feel comfortable and move forward. And that's something we're also trying to define with the customers, right? Like, what would you be comfortable sharing, both for buyers and sellers? And trying to also define like a minimum. If you're not comfortable sharing this much, you shouldn't be selling. That's it. Or you shouldn't be investing. That's it. It is what it is. Or maybe we can save that once we get somebody interested. But yeah, trying to reduce that friction, it's something that we're definitely working on.
And so I was curious, going back to your mention of finances, the tax system in Mexico, et cetera, which quick shout out, the folks at Zuma, if the co-founders at Zuma, definitely get to know them. They help with automating factures and you can use WhatsApp for that. But going back to finances, so actually one of the co-founders of Zuma, she used to work in M&A. And we had a really good chat over the summer about the challenges of M&A in Mexico, in LatAm, et cetera. And part of that was what you mentioned, what Tom mentioned, but it was around just quality of data that you get from companies, as well as finances, the software they use. It seems like most companies are either family-owned businesses that have been around for a while. If they're newer, great. But most of them seem to be using Excel and other spreadsheets for most of their finances. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe QuickBooks doesn't have a presence.
QuickBooks left the country.
Yeah.
There was too much competition. But I was sad about that because going back to my dev shop at the time, we had QuickBooks in the US and Mexico. So it's a very seamless experience. And technically you could even use a desktop version and kind of merge everything. That being said, they left the country. But again, like there are softwares out there. I'm not going to say there's none, but the incumbents aren't, let's say, as API friendly and technologically advanced. So you get all of these like softwares that might like, they don't necessarily allow you to connect and get their info. Maybe because they're afraid that you're stealing it and going to build a competitor. Whatever the reasoning behind it is, that's your thing. But the problem is like, there's a lot of like finance correction and adjustments that we have to do manually for any company. And it is what it is. It's part of the pains that we're seeing. It's definitely something that we're aware of. It's something that we know will be up down the road. I don't want to say we're going to focus on that because again, we're focused on the M&A aspect of this, but I know that others are working on some of these pains. What we're also trying to look at is who's solving these problems and can we collaborate with them? If, for instance, Suma automates all these things and maybe they also help with accounting and making it up, I don't know, but maybe they do. And maybe they're very friendly in terms of collaborating and very technologically advanced and they can share an API with us and we can interconnect and voila, maybe we can even bridge that by saying, there's this connection, plug and play. And It doesn't have to be Suma. There's other players there, and maybe it can be more than one. We don't necessarily need exclusivity, but what we want to see is a better connected ecosystem where financial tools become a bit more plug and play, and there's less of, hey, there's this Excel over here and this Excel over there, and rather the software just executes all of these, or rather connects all of this data and builds whatever reports are needed. But definitely a long way to go. What we're seeing is we have a transaction that has been on hold for more than a month or has been slowing down simply because an accountant kind of being an MIA, responding very slowly. And it's very common in Mexico for you to outsource accounting. And I assume that in the States as well, at least in earlier stages, it doesn't make sense to have an accountant there full time. But we see it, like we see this in transactions where even in the more advanced stages, I need to contact my accountant and data isn't necessarily as clean as it should be. And it doesn't mean that the transaction will fall through. It doesn't mean that the company isn't good. It actually doesn't mean anything rather than it's an inefficiency. So it is definitely something that we're seeing, we're living, we're breathing. And again, not our core mission, but hopefully we can find other players. Your shout out as well. A shout out to anyone out there who's solving just in general, like accounting and finances in LatAm and wants to collaborate. It's definitely something that we're looking at day to day.
Yeah, so that also right there is something I've been incredibly interested in. Maybe I'm biased because I studied accounting in undergrad, but tech-enabled accounting and bookkeeping has been on a tear, an absolute tear in the United States, with different VC firms acquiring, like accounting firms. I've seen plenty of tech-enabled accounting firms go through YC and raise money as well. So I think that's something that I'm really hopeful with, like the more digitally native, younger population in Latin America. That's something that's eventually going to pop up. And maybe at that point, if you have some more digitally native Gen Z folks leading companies, you'll see QuickBooks make an emergence back into
And
Latin America again. So
I'm going to say that it's happening. Like we collaborate with a startup called Monthly. It's monthly.io, if I'm not mistaken. And if not, I'll double check it and share it with you guys later. But these guys do essentially like a CFO as a service and like accounting as a service. And it's a platform. It's not perfect yet, but I think they've got a pretty solid MVP and they've got a solid set of customers. So we already have a specific partner with who we're working. We know they're solving it. But again, I hope that more people push in that space. And one of the things that we're also seeing as well is that we talked about connecting the US, connecting Spain, Canada, Brazil, etc. Regulation, accounting, laws, and whatnot, like they change market per market. So one of the pains that we see that it's inevitable is that as we push into other markets, maybe all that we built in terms of KYB and KYC, here we use the INE, I don't even know what the kind of ID card in the US is called other than your license. The voting card, is there?
no, you primarily just have like your driver's license. It's state by
There
state.
you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in Mexico, you have your driver's license, but you have your INE, which is essentially like your voter's card. And that's more like the more official version of your ID. And I don't know what it is in Brazil. Maybe there's a different type of personal ID.
CPF.
There you go. So it ends up changing region by region. And I'm just talking about like KYC and KYB there. When you start getting into accounting, there's other risks and challenges and whatnot. But I hope that it'll get better over time. As you said, like VCs are looking at it. That space is interesting. And if you know of anyone else working on that space, just let me know.
Yeah, and hopefully once more of these players get established and more business start using them, data gets cleaned up, financials get cleaned up. And I'm sure that'll make valuation a lot easier too, which I'm sure right now is no easy task, and you guys do it in-house. So you must have to have a pretty serious sensitivity table built out for how different things might be just on specific inputs that you're not really sure about. And then on that, doing the manual valuation, doing manual checks, calling all of these buyers and sellers. You talked about it a little bit, but what does the transition look like for the future to scale, to starting as a service-based business? That a lot of startups do that, right? And then they want to transition everything to a more automated platform. And you want to take it all the way to being basically a marketplace facing buyers and sellers.
So there's a lot of things that we need to automate. We've already identified them. It's easy because oftentimes we talk about what the customer needs, but the reality is that right now we're also playing being the customer, right? And what I mean by that is we're an M&A firm, we're a broker, we're a player in that space, and a lot of the tools that the market needs, they don't even know they need them. Like the fact that we could potentially evaluate your company much faster, potentially accelerate the speed at which they can connect with potential buyers. What I'm getting at is like a lot of the features that we need to build have already been dictated internally simply because we are facing these pains and we know that these need to be solved to make sure that we can transact faster. There's obviously other pains that we have to work on for the customers and what the customers are asking for. But interestingly enough, they're not really asking for much, right? We're trying to listen and understand where those pains are, but most we're identifying, let's call them, in the M&A process. So they become evident on their own rather than somebody raising their hand. Some of the things that we've looked at, as we said, is KYC fully automated, ideally proof of funds in terms of investors. Again, maybe it won't be like a full-fledged requirement, but at least let's push in that direction. Connecting to the IRS equivalent, at least in Mexico, and being able to audit finances for, again, Mexican companies that could look like different in other regions. But we're starting, like Mexico's our MVP. It's like the initial battlefield. Like whatever we can do here, we can hopefully replicate it in other regions. Definitely enabling direct communication between buyers and sellers, even if there's like protections on our end where we can block certain things or vet certain things or do certain things. But ideally, we want to slowly remove ourselves from the equation, especially when these transactions are one-to-one, like direct transactions, where we're not the M&A firm or the broker. If Cyrus wants to sell Thomas a startup, be my guest. All I want to do is enable that connection so that we get paid. So if I build more tools and better infrastructure for you, the sooner and faster and easier it'll be for you guys to connect. But yeah, obviously, I don't want to say AI just for the sake of AI. But we do see AI assisting us, particularly in the space of valuations, right? Like we have databases. You mentioned this, like we understand or have again data that can help us better reach a better valuation that makes more sense because of X, Y, Z factors that affect us. Ideally, we should have a software that tells us this rather than us having analysts figure it out, right? Or potentially it gets 80% of the valuation done, but we bring in the last 20% just to make sure that it isn't incorrect. And maybe it runs multiple types of valuations and it provides assessments and like risk assessments, like why maybe one of these valuations is harder to defend, maybe because of the type of company, maybe because of the region, maybe of whatever the reasoning could be. There's I don't want to say obviously, but there's a lot of scenarios where the AI being able to bring up red flags and telling us why something should or shouldn't be a certain way. But definitely a lot of features that we need to build. Again, we're in a very early stage, but hopefully a lot of these will be built pretty soon. And yeah.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
look forward to seeing it. Let's get rid of investment banking analysts. Replace them with AI.
You mentioned about getting rid of investment banking. First, for any investment analyst listening to it, I don't want to get rid of you. We want to again, like I have something that I completely forgot to mention. It a lot of the tools that we're building for ourselves, we're essentially building for the public as well. And what I mean by that is, right now they're internal, but part of our goal is to be able to. So we don't want to defeat M&A firms. We want to empower M&A firms, right? The idea is that eventually you can use our same tools, same stack. Like I don't have a competitive advantage, right? We use the same marketplace with the same tools, with the same rules, and you can get the same type of deals, right? Part of this obviously is there could be a conflict of interest if we're also an M&A firm and we get their data and whatnot. We have one step at a time. But if you think about it, eventually it wouldn't make sense for us to stop being an M&A firm to provide our tools for the market. When you think about eBay or the LatAm equivalent, Mercado Libre doesn't sell shoes, they don't sell headphones, they don't sell anything. They have a marketplace. eBay does the same thing. You don't have a eBay official profile selling rare custom sneakers. They just don't. They just take a cut of every custom sneaker or watch sold there. Down the road, I personally feel or believe that we should become or we will become the de facto or default marketplace for LatAm where let's call them the usual suspects, even if it's the larger ones, and brokers in the regions and larger and medium M&A firms in the region can hop on and connect. And this even enables new connections that aren't necessarily something that we do today. But if that scenario or when that vision kind of starts coming through, you'll have sellers that register that might not have a brokerage firm or person helping them. We could hypothetically enable those connections as well and provide the tools to make this happen. So there's a lot. Again, this is obviously something that we have to continue listening and talking to the M&A firms out there and brokers out there. But it's definitely something that we're seeing. Most of them don't see us as the enemy. We're actually building bridges and partnerships with them where it's you can share deals with us and we can share deals with you, or you can bring them on board and we'll kind of share buyers and sellers, et cetera, et cetera. So again, we're already building these partnerships. What we want to do is kind of bring it to the modern era rather than using WhatsApp or email or Excel. It's hey, you have this amazing set of infrastructure that happens to also be a marketplace that can find your buyer in the next 24 hours and everyone wins.
Yeah. No, I love that comparison with Amazon or Mercado Libre. Like it or not, they make things more efficient for the buyer and seller at the end of the day. More efficient, faster. And that's what we're seeing now and have seen for a very long time in LatAm is there's just a lot of inefficiencies in this market. We look forward to seeing the development of this marketplace and seeing things run a little bit better.
Yeah. And actually, you may not want to get rid of investment banking analysts, but I know at least 2 to 3 companies in the United States that recently pitched me that do.
I mean, everyone working on AI is essentially working to get rid of some shape or form of employment, or at least to reduce it. The way I see it, again, our core product is not AI, so that's why we don't necessarily fight with analysts. But I do see a world where essentially we're starting to see this gap with like people who use AI and people who don't. And Especially, maybe we can start with just talking about ChatGPT, but just kind of like what do you call, like the tip of the iceberg. When we talk about AI, there's specialized tools out there that could essentially, you said, replace an M&A analyst. And I'm not against that in the sense that evolution and these things have to happen. But I want to see Adquiere more of we're one more tool that you can use to superpower yourself. And if AI is going to replace you, I can't stop that anyway, right? I just want to be a tool that maybe helps you have a better chance, a better shot at getting, again, if you're a seller, getting your company acquired, if you're a buyer, buying, and if you're a broker, being part of these transactions. But yeah, AI is there, it's here to stay, and it is what it is.
Yeah, actually, and I don't want to get too off topic, but yeah, I'm big supporter. Most of my career has been around automating and enabling teams with technology, and big supporter of AI will really help teams focus on what's important. So as humans, like creating those connections, focus on the more value add items is really what we do best. And AI really has helped taken like some of the initial workload off of us and gotten us started, which has made overall the workforce more efficient and has enabled us to work faster. So I'm not too worried about AI replacing folks, but I have really enjoyed like the productivity increases that AI has enabled. But taking it back to M&A, one last question I had for you was, and maybe you need a little bit more data on this, but I was curious to see if you had any kind of trends or insights as to typical size of companies that are listing or coming to you for Adquiere, like whether it's like enterprise value, like EBITDA, et cetera. Like what are the typical size of companies that you're seeing that are looking for an acquirer? At what point are they coming to you and trying to list?
So it varies wildly, the response. Like we have companies that are like in startup stage, like they're selling, like a few $1,000s a month or even every few months. So, baby steps kind of startups.
Yeah.
But we have companies already on the platform with over $5 million a year. Again, keep in mind that maybe some of these sums might not sound as large, but Mexico is a smaller market. And just in general, companies won't be as large as Microsoft, Google, or the likes. But again, like bigger companies, like a $5 million, $10 million sales a year company isn't small. We're in process with several companies in 10 million and even one that is about a $50 million a year in sales company again. So it varies wildly, and there isn't like a specific niche or type of company. Like we've seen jewelries, we've seen gyms, we've seen finance startups, KYC startups, we've seen like mobility startups, like at a much later stage, like a large one. And those are some quick examples. But pretty much, if you think about an industry, there's probably a company that has either registered or has already been published on the platform. But I will say that we're seeing an uptick in like smaller businesses wanting to sell as well. I won't get into the details, but let's say companies that are closer to $1 million in sales, which is nice because it's also a sweet spot where let's call these, I want to make one up, but a restaurant with 2 locations and it's like they own the brand. This is not a franchise, right? So it's cool because you get to buy like a brand, you get to buy 2 working locations, profitable working locations. And it's something, again, what we're seeing in the States, right out of MBA. Let's go at it. Let's buy that thing and turn it from 2 to 4 and increase the EBITDA from 30 to 40 or whatnot. So there's very interesting opportunities I'd say, for people that can get access to the capital to buy smaller businesses. Because again, there's quite a few of them that are quite like we've been shocked at how profitable some of these are, and they're not as expensive or as large as we would have expected. So this brings up like a lot of opportunity for people who want to do entrepreneurship through acquisition. And if you're not in that stage, rather you're like a larger enterprise or like a larger company, there's companies on the platform as well that are large. There's a few, as we mentioned, that have been approached both by like corporate, private equity, and search funds. So again, like larger deals are also in the works. But yeah, I know that's not necessarily the answer you wanted. It's like it's so broad that there isn't a specific finding that we've seen.
No, that's totally fair. I expected it to be pretty broad because it really does depend on the company. I've seen small companies such as in the United States. I knew someone that bought an escape room while he was in college, which was, I think he only paid 30 to 40K for it. And then he grew it over time and sold it for a larger amount. But I also know there's companies that you can buy for 4 or 5 or more $1 million or even more than that. So it really just depends. But was curious if there's any specific trends that you saw.
I will say that most likely as we see more companies, we'll start seeing trends. Again, like we talked about earlier, like who's our like target customer. And to a certain degree, we're not 100% sure. And it's not that we aren't listening. But it's rather like we do have startups, we also have SMBs, we also have micro businesses, we have some larger ones, and they're all moving forward. There's offers and interest in kind of all levels. There hasn't been like a super clear indicator. I will say, however, that like SMBs have been more attractive for investors than startups. It's harder to say, here, have $1 million or whatever it is you're raising, and yay, I got 10% versus here, have $1 million and I get to keep the company. And maybe I do even like sellers financing and I make this work. I'll say that's the only trends that I could say that I've seen. Like SMBs are a bit hotter because you're actually acquiring like an entire operation versus a very small slice.
Yeah, I got to say from personal experience, yeah, I mean, my path to investing was I actually acquired SMB first before I started investing in any VC funds or startups, et cetera. And my whole thinking was with SMBs, you can, especially if it's already existing, the attractiveness about entrepreneurship through acquisition is you don't have to do the hard part of building something from scratch and trying to going through the tough times of maybe you don't have enough revenue to pay yourself like a standard salary. But with companies that are already running and you have positive cash flow, you're generating cash like out from the get-go once you purchase the company. That was my experience as well. I purchased a business, was already generating cash flow. And from there, that then enabled me to then go and angel invest into startups, which you're probably not going to see returns for probably a decade on the longer end. But that's, yeah. So I see the attractiveness there.
What you're saying there is what I was saying earlier, right? Like it's this virtuous cycle. Like you get liquidity and you put it back into the system. And what we're seeing, and again, this isn't even something I said. I recall it was like 2 months after we launched Endeavor, which is huge. It's one of the world's largest kind of VC and startup and investor entities out there. And they had this, I can't recall if it's a global event or Mexican event, but regardless, they came out with this like news article where it said the biggest pain in LatAm is a lack of exits. And I'm like, I literally just shared it and said, I didn't say it, they did. We're just solving it. It's all that we're doing. We understand. And again, we're certain that is the biggest pain. And we firmly believe that it's a vicious cycle. There's lack of exits, therefore there's less cash. And then it just keeps moving, spiraling. And if we start to get some of these exits rolling, hopefully we'll get some liquidity back, which will in turn kind of put some of that cash back in and hopefully turn that vicious cycle into a virtuous one. Even if it's not like a massive like snowball, it could be slower. We can take a decade to build this, but it has to happen.
So what is some advice you give to whether it's a startup founder or SMB owner that wants to sell within, say, like the next 1 to 3 years if they're looking for an exit for whatever reason? What should they start doing today?
Although we're trying to 10x improve this space in 10x, the reality is that we're not quite there yet. So transactions take time. Until we can literally say we'll sell any company within a month, the reality is that transactions typically take between 6 to 12 months. Some go even further, due diligence, financing, whatever. So there's more roadblocks there. So you have to get prepared to sell. It's not something that just happens magically. Ideally, and I don't want to necessarily do this as a plugin. You don't even have to hire us or work with us. You can go work with a broker and an M&A firm, maybe do it yourself, like ask ChatGPT how to do it. But we talked about finances. Try to get rid of all these mixed finances, remove all this kind of bloat that your company has, and start focusing on what a seller is looking for. A seller is looking for a healthy EBITDA, a company that is growing, a company that is stable, that has contracts. Have you historically just shook hands and that's your contract? Sign contracts, right? Like contracts have a value once you sell a company. If you have all these kind of family finances and whatnot, again, get that out, clean your situation. And I guess the last point is get started early is what I'm going at. It's not going to happen overnight. So start now so that once you're ready to sell, selling is easier. And hopefully you can sell in a month to 3 rather than 6 or 12.
Yeah, and it is a painful process. It shouldn't be, right? I think you guys are definitely making it a lot better for both the buyer and seller. But it's definitely a painful process. It's a tough market, and we're really glad that you're the one trying to tackle it and trying to fix what everyone keeps saying is the biggest issue in LatAm that we see daily as far as exits go. Is liquidity in the markets. Thank you so much for your time, and we're really excited to see how you guys continue to grow.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of La Frontera. We hope you enjoyed the show. You can listen to more great conversations on our Spotify, as well as on your other favorite streaming platforms. You can find us online at lafronterapodcast.com. And make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for show notes and to stay in the loop for new content. Ciao for now.